Every farmer in the county upgraded. The man with the Massey Ferguson didn't. 10 years later, he bought two of their farms. Open on black. No music, no narration, just silence. Then a single sound, the low, steady idle of a diesel engine that has been running long enough to settle into its own rhythm. Not straining, not performing, just running. The way a machine runs when it has been maintained by someone who understands that reliability is not an accident. It is a decision made every morning, every service interval, every season, for years without interruption. The image comes up slowly. A field at early light, frost still on the stalks from the night before. A red tractor working the near edge of a field that extends further than the camera can follow. Behind it, the kind of work that does not announce itself, straight, consistent, unglamorous. The work of a man who is not trying to impress anyone. His name was Gerald Foss. He farmed 1,100 acres in a county where ambition was visible and loudly expressed, where equipment decisions were made at least partly in public, and where the size of a man's iron said something, or was supposed to say something, about the seriousness of his operation. Gerald Foss had been ignoring that calculation for so long that most of the county had stopped expecting anything different from him. The Massey Ferguson he was running that morning was not new. It had not been new for a long time. Gerald knew every hour on it, every service record, every repair. He knew what it cost him to run and what it produced and what it would be worth if he ever decided to sell it, which he had not decided and did not plan to decide anytime soon. Around him, on farms that shared his county roads and his co-op and his grain elevator, men were making different decisions. Bigger decisions, newer decisions. Decisions that came with larger monthly notes and more impressive specifications and the kind of pride that is visible from the road when a new machine sits on a well-maintained dealer lot with your name on the purchase order. Gerald Foss was not making those decisions. He was running his Massey Ferguson. He was watching. He was keeping records. 10 years later, he would own two of their farms. This is how that happened. The upgrade cycle in that county began in earnest around the time commodity prices hit a run that made everyone feel wealthy. Corn was strong. Soybeans were strong. The futures market looked, to men who wanted to believe in it, like a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. Lenders were accommodating. Dealers were aggressive. The combination of high prices, available credit, and competitive pressure between equipment brands produced an environment in which buying new iron felt not just reasonable, but responsible, like the natural behavior of a serious farming operation during a period of prosperity. The first of Gerald's neighbors to upgrade in a significant way was a man named Boyd Kramer, who farmed 1,600 acres to Gerald's north. Boyd was a capable farmer and a proud one. When the John Deere dealer came out with a financing package that made a new 8R series tractor feel accessible on a monthly payment basis, Boyd signed. He signed with the confidence of a man whose crop checks had been strong for 2 years and who saw no reason to expect anything different. The machine arrived on a Tuesday. Gerald saw it from his lane when Boyd drove it home, big, green, unmistakable in the afternoon light. Gerald watched it pass and said nothing. He went back inside and opened his equipment cost folder and looked at his numbers for a while. Then he closed the folder and went to bed. 2 weeks later, the Hendersons, a father and son operation 2 miles east, took delivery of a new Case IH Magnum. Different brand, same logic. The financing was favorable. The horsepower was impressive on paper. The son, who was 34 and had strong opinions about precision agriculture integration, had driven the argument over the kitchen table until the father agreed. Gerald Foss heard about both purchases at the co-op. He heard about them without comment, which people in that county had come to expect from him. Gerald Foss's silence was not ignorance. Everyone who knew him understood that. His silence was the specific silence of a man who is listening and calculating and keeping his conclusions to himself until the numbers make them unavoidable. By the end of that first year of the upgrade cycle, 6 operations in the county had taken on significant new equipment debt. The machines were real and capable. The debt was real and substantial. The commodity prices that had made the debt feel manageable were, though no one knew it yet, near their peak. Gerald's Massey Ferguson ran through that year without incident. He serviced it on schedule. He kept his records. He banked his margin instead of spending it on iron. The man Gerald's neighbors did not think about during the upgrade years was Phil Tanner, the agricultural lender at the county bank who had processed most of the equipment loans. Phil was not a dramatic man. He did not give speeches about farm debt or circulate warnings about commodity price cycles. He did his job, which was to lend money to credit-worthy borrowers at terms that reflected the risk involved. But Phil had been doing his job in that county for 22 years. He had seen the mid-'80s. He had seen the correction in the 90s. He had seen what happened to operations that structured their debt around peak commodity prices and then had to service that debt when the market corrected. He had seen it enough times to know the pattern, and the pattern was not subtle. He processed the loans, he noted the debt-to-asset ratios, he filed the paperwork, and he made a mental note, in the private way that careful lenders make private notes, of which operations had absorbed new debt without a corresponding increase in their productive capacity, and which operations had not. Gerald Foss had not. Gerald's file at the bank was clean, the same clean file it had been for 15 years. No new equipment debt, no operating line increases, a farm that was producing and banking its margin and not asking the bank for anything it had not already earned. Phil noticed this. He said nothing about it at the time. He would say something about it later at a moment when saying it would matter. The commodity price correction began in the third year of the upgrade cycle. Not a crash, not the kind of sudden visible collapse that makes news and produces emergency meetings at the Farm Bureau. A correction. A gradual, persistent softening of prices that compressed margin on farms that were running lean and eliminated it entirely on farms that were running on the assumption that strong prices were permanent. The operations that had taken on new equipment debt during the strong years now faced a specific and difficult arithmetic. The monthly note on a $280,000 tractor does not adjust for commodity price softening. It remains what it was when the ink was dry and the machine was on the lot. The income side of the ledger shrinks. The debt service side does not. The gap between them has to come from somewhere. And on a farm that is already running efficiently, there are limited places to find it. Boyd Kramer found it in his operating line. He drew on it more heavily in year one of the correction than he had in any previous year. He told himself it was temporary. Most men do. The operating line is designed for exactly this kind of temporary need, and Boyd was not wrong to use it. But using it changed his relationship with the bank, and changing his relationship with the bank meant that Phil Tanner was now looking at Boyd's file more carefully than he had before. The Henderson operation, the father and son with the Case IH Magnum, handled the correction differently. The son, who had driven the equipment decision, responded to compressed margin by pushing harder on volume. More acres, more inputs, more production, the theory being that volume could compensate for margin compression. This theory is not without logic, but it requires capital to execute, and capital was what the correction was squeezing out of the operation. By the end of year two of the correction, both Boyd Kramer and the Henderson operation were having conversations with Phil Tanner that were qualitatively different from any conversation they had ever had with him before. Gerald Foss was not having those conversations. Gerald's operating line was where it had always been. His equipment cost for that year was what his record said it would be, because Gerald's equipment cost was always what his record said it would be. He went to the elevator, sold his grain, deposited the check, and continued to say very little at the co-op. It was at the co-op, in the third winter of the correction, that the first public acknowledgement of what was happening appeared. Not in a dramatic way, not in a confrontation or a confession, just in the specific change of tone that happens in a small community when the gap between public posture and private reality becomes too large to maintain. Boyd Kramer came in on a Thursday morning, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He bought his coffee and stood at the counter and talked about input prices and the futures market and the weather forecast for the following week. He did not mention his operating line. He did not mention the conversation he had had with Phil Tanner 2 weeks earlier, in which Phil had used the phrase structural concern for the first time in their 20-year relationship. Gerald Foss came in 20 minutes later. He bought his coffee. He listened to the conversation at the counter. He asked one question about a county road project and then stood quietly for a while before leaving. Nobody at the co-op was tracking any of this consciously, but the information was in the room. Boyd's fatigue, Gerald's steadiness. The contrast between a man carrying a weight he had not expected to carry and a man who had not picked up that weight in the first place. The younger Henderson, the son who had pushed for the Case IH, stopped coming to the co-op around this time. His father came alone. He drank his coffee faster than he used to and left without staying to talk. These are small things, but in a county where everyone watches everyone, small things accumulate into a picture. Gerald Foss made one significant move during the correction years. Not a purchase, not yet. A conversation. He called Phil Tanner at the bank in January of the second correction year and asked for a meeting. Not because he needed anything, not because his file required attention. He asked for a meeting because he wanted to understand from the most informed perspective available to him what the current credit environment looked like for agricultural operations in the county. Phil told him, with the measured honesty of a banker who trusted the man across the desk, that the environment was stressed, that several operations were carrying debt loads that the current commodity environment was not supporting, that the next 12 to 18 months would tell a significant story about which farms in the county were structured for the long term and which ones had been structured for a commodity price peak that no longer existed. Gerald asked what that story might look like in practical terms. What did a farm that could not service its debt do next? What were the options? What were the timelines? What did resolution look like from the bank's perspective? Phil answered these questions carefully and completely. He answered them the way he answered questions from a man he expected to be relevant to the resolution, not just an observer of it. Gerald thanked him, went home, and updated his records. The first farm to move toward resolution was not Boyd Kramer's, and it was not the Henderson operation. It was a smaller place, 680 acres operated by a man named Dennis Rule, who had bought a new tractor and a new planter in the same year during the commodity peak, and whose debt service had outrun his cash flow before the correction was even fully underway. Dennis was a decent farmer and a decent man. He was not reckless by nature. He had made the same calculation that dozens of men in dozens of counties made during that period, that strong prices justified the debt, that growth required investment, that the monthly note was manageable at current margins. The margins had not stayed current. Dennis's farm went to a negotiated sale in the spring of the third correction year. Not a foreclosure, a negotiated sale, which is what happens when a man and his banker agree that the most dignified and financially rational path forward is a transaction rather than a proceeding. The ground was good ground. Dennis knew it. He had farmed it for 19 years, and it had produced well for him in the years when the numbers were on his side. The listing went out through the county agricultural broker. Gerald Foss saw it the day it was posted. He called his accountant that afternoon. He called Phil Tanner the following morning. He had a purchase offer on Dennis Rule's 680 acres within 10 days of the listing. The offer was not aggressive. It was fair, priced at what the ground was worth in a normalized market, not at a distressed discount that would have insulted Dennis or complicated the transaction unnecessarily. Gerald did not negotiate hard. He offered a price he could justify, and he paid it. Dennis accepted within 48 hours. There was nothing dramatic about the closing. 2 men at a table, a banker, a title company. Dennis shook Gerald's hand and said to take care of the ground. Gerald said he would. He drove home and updated his records. He now farmed 1,780 acres. The Massey Ferguson that he had run for 11 years would need to cover more ground next season. He scheduled a full-service inspection for the following week. Boyd Kramer's situation resolved more slowly and more publicly. Boyd had more ground, more debt, and more pride invested in the outcome. A combination that made the process longer and more visible. He renegotiated his operating line twice. He sold a piece of equipment at auction, not his primary tractor, but ancillary equipment, in an attempt to reduce his debt load without surrendering the core of his operation. The auction sale was attended by men from the county who did not need to be there, who had come because word had traveled and because in a small county, the line between support and witnessing is thin. Gerald Foss was not at that auction. He had no reason to be there. He was not in the market for what Boyd was selling, and he did not attend other men's difficulties as a spectator. He heard about the sale secondhand at the co-op from someone who had been there. Boyd held on for another year after the auction. Then, in the fall, he had a conversation with Phil Tanner that ended with an agreement to list the operation. Not all of it. Boyd retained his house and a small acreage around the home place. But the productive ground, all 1,600 acres of it, went to market in late October. Gerald made an offer on 420 acres of Boyd's ground, the parcel that bordered his own operation most directly, the parcel whose tile drainage connected to infrastructure Gerald already managed. He did not attempt to acquire all of Boyd's ground. He took what fit his operation and left the rest for other buyers. The offer was accepted. The closing happened in December, in the same quiet way that Gerald's first acquisition had happened. No drama, no celebration. A transaction between men who understood what it represented without needing to say so. Gerald Foss drove home from the closing in the same truck he had driven for 7 years. He did not stop at the co-op. He did not call anyone. He went home and sat at his kitchen table with his yellow legal pad and updated his numbers. He now farmed 2,200 acres. He had done it without a single dollar of equipment debt in the preceding decade. He had done it by running a machine that his neighbors had stopped noticing years ago, because a machine that simply works tends to become invisible in an environment where everyone is chasing something newer. The Massey Ferguson was in the shed. It would start in the morning. It would do the work. It always had. The co-op conversation that Gerald did not have was had about him instead. That winter, after the news of the 2 acquisitions had settled into the county's understanding of itself, men talked about Gerald Foss the way men talk about someone whose logic has become undeniable. Not always generously. There is rarely warmth in the acknowledgement that someone else was right when you were wrong. But honestly, someone said that Gerald had always run his numbers differently from everyone else. Someone else said that was not true, that Gerald ran his numbers the same way everyone was supposed to run theirs. He just actually did it. A third man said that Gerald had been lucky with commodity timing on the acquisitions, that he could not have planned for the correction. A fourth man said that Gerald had been ready for any correction, that readiness and luck were not the same thing. Boyd Kramer was not in the co-op that morning. He had not been coming in much since the sale. That was understandable. The county gave him space, the way it gives space to men who have gone through something difficult and public. Time would bring him back. It usually did. Dennis Rule had moved to a town 2 counties over. He was working in agricultural equipment sales, which was, in its way, a reasonable use of the knowledge a farmer accumulates over 19 years of purchasing and operating machinery. He was reported to be doing well. Gerald hoped that was true. Gerald Foss did not expand his equipment significantly after the acquisitions. This was the part that confused people who tried to understand his approach through the lens of conventional farming ambition. He had grown from 1,100 acres to 2,200 acres and had added no new iron. He hired a second full-time operator for the additional ground. He ran both his Massey Fergusons, the older primary unit, and a second machine he had purchased used 3 years earlier from a retiring neighbor, across the expanded operation, and managed the timing accordingly. The math worked because he had built it to work. His cost per acre was lower than any comparable operation in the county. His debt service was manageable. His operating lines stayed within the range he had established years ago, even with the additional ground, because the additional ground was generating income that justified its purchase price and its operating cost without requiring the farm to bet on a commodity price that might not hold. His neighbor to the south, a younger farmer named Marcus, who was watching all of this with the attention of a man who was still early enough in his career to change his thinking, asked Gerald once what his philosophy was. He asked it directly, over a fence line conversation. the way younger farmers sometimes ask older ones when they have run out of ways to figure something out on their own. Gerald thought about it for a moment. He was not a man who had prepared answers to philosophical questions about farming. He had records and numbers and a service history on his equipment. Philosophy was not what he kept in the folder. He said that he had never bought anything he could not explain to the bank using only his actual numbers, not his projected ones. He said that projected numbers were hopes dressed up as arithmetic. He said that his actual numbers, in any given year, had to support the debt he was carrying without requiring the next year to be better than the one before. Marcus said that sounded simple. Gerald said it was. He said that most of the things that kept farms alive were simple. The hard part was not understanding them. The hard part was not stopping. The Massey Ferguson that Gerald Foss had run through the upgrade years, through the correction, through the acquisitions, through the expansion to 2,200 acres, finally retired from primary field duty in the 12th year. Not because it failed, not because it became unreliable, because it had accumulated enough hours that Gerald's mechanic, a man named Sutton who had maintained that machine for 9 years, told him that the cost-benefit of a major upcoming service had shifted enough to justify replacement. Gerald agreed. He looked at the current Massey Ferguson lineup, ran his numbers the same way he had always run them, and bought a replacement unit that was appropriate for his operation. He paid a fair price. He financed a portion of it at a rate his cash flow supported without stress. He kept the older machine as a backup unit rather than selling it because the residual value on the used market was lower than the insurance value of having a known, reliable backup during harvest. Sutton went over the new machine with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. He said it was solid. He said the engineering on the current generation was genuinely good. He said Gerald had chosen well. Gerald said he had run the numbers. Sutton said he knew. Sutton had always known. The 2 farms that Gerald acquired in the correction years were, by the time a decade had passed, fully integrated into an operation that had become one of the more stable and productive in the county. Not the largest. Gerald had no interest in being the largest. Largest was a public metric, and Gerald did not manage to public metrics. He managed to his yellow legal pad, to his service records, to his operating line balance, and to the quiet satisfaction of a farm that was still working when others had stopped. Boyd Kramer came back to the co-op eventually. It took about 2 years, which is the right amount of time for a county to let a man return without ceremony. He and Gerald stood at the counter one morning and talked about input prices and the weather forecast and a county road project. They did not talk about the ground that had changed hands, or the machine that had made the difference, or the decade of decisions that separated where they had each ended up. They did not need to. The county knew. Everyone in that room knew. The information was present without being stated, the way it always is in a place where everyone has watched everyone for long enough that the stories are written in the silences between sentences. Gerald finished his coffee. He had work to do. The Massey Ferguson, the new one, the replacement, the machine chosen by the same process that had chosen every machine before it, was in the shed, serviced and ready. He drove home on the county road, past the fields that used to belong to Dennis Rule, past the ground that used to belong to Boyd Kramer, past the equipment dealer where some of those decisions had been made, years ago, by men who had believed that the price of iron was the price of ambition, and that ambition was something you owed yourself, regardless of what the numbers said. Gerald Foss had never believed that. He had believed that the price of iron was exactly what it cost to own, operate, and eventually replace, and that every dollar beyond that number was borrowed from somewhere that would eventually ask for it back. The farms along that road were the answer to the question of whether he had been right. He turned into his lane. The shed doors were open. The machine was waiting. He had work to do.